On the morning the house was finished, a pipe organ began to play. The sound travelled through 14 acres of roofline, past 45 bathrooms and a ballroom that could hold 300 guests, down corridors lined with tapestries older than the American Republic, through the private gymnasium and the refrigerating plant in the movie theatre, with its velvet seats, until it reached the stables, where the horses stirred in their stalls at the vibration of music that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was 1921. Edward Stotesbury, 72 years old and the richest banker in America, stood in the entrance hall of Whitemarsh Hall and listened to the organ he had commissioned fill his new home with sound. Beside him stood Horace Trumbauer, the architect who had spent 5 years turning $100 million of Morgan money into 100,000 square feet of French neoclassical ambition. The house had 147 rooms. The construction had been delayed by a world war. The interior decorations, shipped from Europe in crates that crossed an ocean full of German submarines, had arrived in fragments over years, reassembled by craftsmen who spoke no English, supervised by foremen who spoke no French. And now it was done. The Philadelphia Inquirer would report that prominent travellers who toured the estate declared they had never seen such splendour. The News Journal called it a magnificent palace, a marvel of beauty and completeness. When the French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau visited, he pronounced it America's answer to the Palace of Versailles. But none of them, not the journalists, not the Prime Minister, not even Stotesbury himself as he listened to his organ echo through his palace, understood what they were really looking at. Because Whitemarsh Hall was not a home. It was an industrial enterprise disguised as elegance. It was a factory for the production of comfort, a machine for the maintenance of wealth, a small economy unto itself that consumed coal by the ton and labour by the hundred and money at a rate of over $1 million per year. Just to keep the lights on, the gardens trimmed, the silver polished, the illusion intact. To understand this house, you cannot follow the man who paid for it. You must follow the people who ran it. The scale was the first problem. Imagine standing at the centre of Whitemarsh Hall on a winter morning in 1922, the year after its completion. You're in the entrance hall, beneath a ceiling that rises 30 feet above your head. The floor beneath your feet is marble, cold enough to feel through the soles of your shoes. Ahead of you, a grand staircase sweeps upward in a curve designed to make every descent feel like an entrance at a ball. To your left, a corridor stretches toward the ballroom and the music room and the drawing rooms beyond. To your right, another corridor leads toward the library, the study, the private apartments of the Stotesburys themselves. Behind you, the main doors, bronze, 12 feet tall, open onto a courtyard that could accommodate 50 automobiles. And beneath your feet, invisible, a heating plant the size of a small factory burns coal around the clock. This is the first thing you must understand about Whitemarsh Hall. It was not a house in any meaningful sense. It was a building that required constant industrial-scale intervention simply to remain habitable. The heating plant did not warm the house the way a fireplace warms a room. It fought a constant battle against the cold that radiated from 100,000 square feet of exterior wall, from 45 bathrooms worth of plumbing that would freeze and burst if the temperature dropped, from marble floors that absorbed heat and refused to give it back. The coal had to be delivered by truck, unloaded by workers, fed into furnaces by stokers who worked in shifts, because the furnaces could never go out, not in January, not at 3 a.m, not on Christmas Day. The gardens presented an equivalent problem. 400 acres surrounded the house, and while much of that was woodland and pasture, the formal gardens alone required an army. More than 70 gardeners worked the grounds at Whitemarsh Hall. 70. Consider what that means. Consider the logistics of employing 70 men to do a single task. The scheduling, the supervision, the housing, the feeding, the payroll, the management of 70 individual human beings who had to be coordinated like an infantry unit simply to keep the hedges trimmed and the flowers blooming in their appointed seasons. And those 70 gardeners represented only the outdoor staff. Inside the house, another 40 people worked full-time, though full-time does not capture the reality. Many of these servants did not merely work at Whitemarsh Hall, they lived there. They slept in more than 30 rooms set aside for domestic staff, rooms that the Stotesburys themselves rarely saw, rooms with their own hierarchies and their own rules, and their own invisible geographies. A visitor touring the grand public spaces of Whitemarsh Hall would never glimpse these quarters, just as they would never see the service corridors and the back staircases and the kitchen complex and the laundry rooms, an entire shadow architecture built to make the visible architecture appear effortless. This shadow architecture was not an afterthought. Horace Trumbauer had designed it deliberately, because a house of this scale could not function without it. The servants needed to be everywhere and nowhere, present to anticipate every need, invisible so that the illusion of gracious living would remain unbroken. And so, Whitemarsh Hall contained two houses: the house the Stotesburys lived in, with its ballrooms and its libraries and its heated swimming pool, and the house that made that house possible, with its coal furnaces and its service elevators, and its warren of narrow corridors where footmen in livery passed one another on their way to tasks that would never be acknowledged. The cost, as Stotesbury himself acknowledged, exceeded $1 million annually. That figure, in 1921 dollars, represented more than what most American factories spent on their entire operations. It represented more than the annual budget of small municipalities. It was not an expense in the way that buying a house is an expense. It was a commitment, an industrial overhead, a permanent drain that would continue as long as the house stood and as long as someone wanted to live in it, and someone had to manage all of it. The head butler of a great house in the 1920s occupied a position that had no real equivalent in the outside world. He was not a servant in the way that a maid or a footman was a servant. He was closer to what a modern corporation might call a chief operating officer, though that comparison misses the feudal quality of the role, the way his authority depended not on any written contract but on a system of deference and tradition that stretched back centuries to the great houses of England and France. The head butler answered only to the family. Everyone else in the household, every footman, every valet, every chauffeur, every man who worked inside the walls of the house, answered to him. He set the dress code. He determined which livery would be worn on which occasions, how the silver would be polished, how the table would be laid, how guests would be announced, how the mail would be sorted, how the wine would be decanted, and how every male servant beneath him would speak, stand, and comport himself in the presence of the family and their guests. He was the enforcer of standards that were never written down because they did not need to be. Everyone who entered service in a house like Whitemarsh Hall understood that the head butler's word was law, and that his displeasure could end a career with a single unfavourable reference. He also managed a logistics operation of extraordinary complexity. Consider for a moment what it meant to host a dinner party at Whitemarsh Hall. Not one of the legendary balls that filled the newspapers, but an ordinary dinner party of the sort the Stotesburys might hold several times a month. 40 guests, perhaps? Or 60. A 7-course meal. Wine with every course. Flowers on every table. Candles lit at a precise hour. Carriages and automobiles arriving in sequence. Guests announced by name. Coats taken. Drinks offered. Conversations facilitated. Dinner served at exactly the appointed moment. Plates cleared with military precision. Coffee and brandy in the drawing room, coats returned, automobiles summoned, farewells observed. All of this required planning that began days in advance. It required coordination between the butler's staff and the kitchen staff, and the housemaids and the gardeners who cut the flowers. It required inventories of crystal and china and silver. It required the management of a serving staff who would be visible to guests and therefore could not make a single error, could not spill a drop, could not hesitate, could not speak unless spoken to, could not betray by any expression that they were anything other than silent, graceful extensions of the house itself. And this was the easy part, because the Stotesburys did not live only at Whitemarsh Hall. They kept 3 great houses: Whitemarsh outside Philadelphia, El Mirasol in Palm Beach for the winter, and Wingwood House in Maine for the summer. Much of the inside staff travelled with them, following the seasonal migration of American wealth that moved south when the weather turned cold, and north when the heat of Florida became unbearable. The head butler had to manage not merely one household, but the coordination of 3, ensuring that the staff who travelled arrived at the correct destination at the correct time, that the houses being left behind were properly closed and maintained in the family's absence, and that the houses being opened were ready to receive their owners as if by magic. Fires lit, beds made, flowers arranged, the illusion of effortless perfection intact despite the hundreds of miles and the dozens of logistical complications that separated one estate from another. This was the world the head butler commanded. His salary reflected his importance. In an era when a factory worker might earn $1,000 a year, the head butler of a house like Whitemarsh Hall could command several times that figure. Not wealth by the standards of the family he served, but a respectable professional income, enough to save, enough to retire on, enough to make him the envy of every footman beneath him. The French chef occupied a different position entirely. Where the butler was a general, managing troops across multiple theatres of domestic war, the chef was a sovereign, absolute ruler of a single domain that no one else dared to enter. The kitchen at Whitemarsh Hall was his kingdom. The staff who worked under him, the sous chefs, the sauciers, the pastry cooks, the kitchen maids, were his subjects. The food that left his kitchen represented not merely nutrition but reputation, and the reputation of a great house rose or fell on the quality of its table. The chef answered, in theory, to the head butler and through him to the family. In practice, he answered to no one. A truly skilled French chef in 1920s America was a rare commodity, recruited from the great kitchens of Paris at enormous expense, and he knew his own value. If he was displeased, he left, and finding a replacement of equivalent caliber might take months or years. The family could more easily replace a butler than a chef, and so the chef's autonomy was protected by an unspoken bargain. He would produce food of the highest quality, food that would make the house famous, food that visiting dignitaries and society columnists would remember and praise, and in exchange, he would be left alone. He also earned a salary commensurate with a senior professional in any field, a doctor's income, a lawyer's income, enough to reflect the specialised skill he brought to the house. When French Prime Minister Clemenceau declared Whitemarsh Hall to be America's Versailles, the comparison was not merely architectural. It extended to the table, to the meals that emerged from that kitchen, to the sauces and the soufflés and the carefully constructed menus that could match anything served in the great houses of Europe. And then there was the housekeeper. She controlled the female staff, every housemaid, every chambermaid, every parlourmaid, every woman who worked inside the walls of Whitemarsh Hall. The head butler ruled the male servants, the housekeeper ruled the female. The two domains rarely intersected, except at the highest levels where butler and housekeeper coordinated the operation of the house as a whole. But the housekeeper's authority differed from the butler's in one crucial respect. She was responsible not merely for the work her staff performed, but for their morality. Great houses of this era operated under a code of conduct that later generations would find unrecognisable. Female servants were expected to remain unmarried for as long as they held their positions. Their movements were monitored, their time off-limited, their interactions with male staff carefully policed. They lived in the house, they worked in the house, and they were expected to have no life outside the house that might compromise their availability or their reputation. The housekeeper enforced these rules with an authority that contemporaries often compared to a convent's mother superior. She conducted inspections, she set schedules, she determined which girls would be promoted and which would be dismissed. She controlled access to the female servants' quarters as absolutely as any abbess controlled access to a cloister. A housemaid who was discovered to have a suitor, or who stayed out past her curfew, or who was found in any location of the house where she had no business being, could expect swift consequences, and the housekeeper's judgment, like the butler's, was final. This was the hierarchy that governed Whitemarsh Hall. 3 kingdoms, each with its own sovereign, each with its own rules and its own subjects, all balanced against one another in a system of interlocking authority that had evolved over centuries in the great houses of Europe and been transplanted fully formed to the estates of American industrial wealth. But there was another hierarchy beneath this one, and it was built on a fault line that ran deeper than any distinction between butler and chef, between male staff and female. The black servants at Whitemarsh Hall worked in the kitchen and the laundry. This was standard practice in great American houses of the 1920s, so standard that no one remarked upon it, so standard that the household ledgers that recorded the head butler's salary to the penny often failed to record the names of the black cooks and laundresses at all. They were listed, if they were listed, as categories rather than individuals. Cook, laundress, kitchen help. The European staff, the French chef, the English butler, the German footman, the Irish parlourmaids, appeared in records by name, with their wages noted and their tenure tracked. The black staff existed in the margins, paid a fraction of what their white counterparts earned for work that was often heavier, hotter, and more physically demanding. The kitchen in a house like Whitemarsh Hall was not the gleaming electrified space that a modern viewer might imagine. It was closer to an industrial operation. Coal-fired stoves that produced waves of heat in summer sinks that required constant manual pumping, copper pots so heavy that lifting them demanded real strength. The French chef orchestrated the production of elegant meals. The black cooks and kitchen workers did much of the brute labour that made those meals possible. The peeling, the chopping, the scrubbing, the hauling of supplies from storerooms, the disposal of waste, the endless cleaning that a working kitchen demands. The laundry was worse. A house of 147 rooms generated linens in industrial quantities, sheets for dozens of beds, towels for 45 bathrooms, tablecloths for a dining room that might seat 40 guests, napkins, handkerchiefs, undergarments, uniforms, an endless cascade of fabric that had to be washed, pressed, folded, and returned to circulation. Laundry work in the 1920s was punishing physical labour. It involved vats of boiling water, caustic soap, mechanical wringers that could crush a hand, irons heated on coal stoves to temperatures that left burns. The laundresses who performed this work at Whitemarsh Hall, the records that exist suggest they were predominantly black women, did so for wages that barely rose above subsistence. They occupied the lowest tier of the household hierarchy, a tier that intersected with the visible hierarchy of butler and housekeeper only at certain points. They ate separately. They slept separately. The elaborate system of back staircases and service corridors that kept the servants invisible to the family also kept different tiers of servants invisible to one another. A footman in livery, trained to move through the public rooms with silent grace, rarely crossed paths with a laundress hauling wet sheets through the basement corridors. This separation was architectural, but it was also social. The European staff who occupied the upper tiers of service often came from families that had been in domestic service for generations. They brought with them a culture of professionalism, a set of standards and expectations, a sense of themselves as skilled practitioners of a demanding craft. They were paid accordingly, they were housed accordingly, they were recorded in the ledgers accordingly. The black workers who occupied the lower tiers came from a different America, an America where the options available to a black woman in 1921 were vanishingly narrow, where domestic work was often the only work available, and where the wages offered for that work reflected not the difficulty of the labour but the desperation of those who had no choice but to accept it. They performed the heaviest labour for the smallest wages, their names unrecorded, their contributions invisible, and yet the house could not have functioned without them. This is the truth that the grand entrance hall and the pipe organ and the 45 bathrooms and the ballroom all concealed, that the beauty of Whitemarsh Hall rested on a foundation of human labour, and that labour was organised according to a caste system as rigid and as brutal as any that has ever existed in America. The distinction between the butler earning a professional salary and the laundress earning a fraction of that wage was not a matter of skill alone. It was a matter of race, of origin, of which bodies could be seen and which had to remain hidden. The separate staircases that Horace Trumbauer designed into his masterpiece were not merely practical, they were ideological. They encoded into the architecture itself the belief that different kinds of people belonged in different kinds of places, that some workers deserved to move through the grand spaces of the house, and others deserved only to move through the shadows. Inside the walls of Whitemarsh Hall, everyone knew the rules. The hierarchy of dining tables alone made them clear. The head butler and the housekeeper ate at the head of the servants' table. Below them, in descending order of status, sat the upper servants, the valets, the ladies' maids, the senior housemaids. Below them, the junior staff, and somewhere else entirely, in spaces that the upper servants rarely entered. The kitchen workers and the laundresses ate their meals among themselves. Who could speak to whom was governed by protocol. A junior housemaid did not address the butler directly unless spoken to first. A footman did not presume to familiarity with the French chef, and the black workers in the kitchen and the laundry existed for purposes of social interaction in a separate universe. Tolerated, necessary, invisible. This was the social world that the Stotesburys' $1 million per year purchased. Not merely a house, but an entire society. Stratified, hierarchical, governed by rules that were all the more powerful for being unwritten. Edward Stotesbury walked through his entrance hall and listened to his pipe organ, and believed perhaps that he had built something beautiful. He had built something else. He had built a world, and worlds, once built, must be maintained. The $1 million that flowed through Whitemarsh Hall each year was not an endowment, but a metabolism, a constant expenditure of fuel required to keep the organism alive. the 70 gardeners pruning the hedges into geometric perfection, the 40 inside staff circulating through the corridors in their prescribed orbits, the coal fires burning in the heating plant, the copper pipes carrying hot water to 45 bathrooms, the French chef commanding his kitchen, the housekeeper enforcing her protocols, the butler orchestrating the endless logistics of arrival and departure, of dinner for 12 and dinner for 300, of the seasonal migrations to Palm Beach and Bar Harbor and back again. All of it required money, and in October of 1929, the money began to disappear. The crash did not destroy Edward Stotesbury immediately. He was 70 years old when Black Tuesday arrived, and he had survived panics before, 1893, 1907, the tremors and aftershocks that periodically rippled through American finance. He was a partner at J.P. Morgan. He had weathered storms, but this storm was different. This storm did not pass. It settled in and stayed, and as the months became years, the ground beneath Whitemarsh Hall began to shift. The first cuts were invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. A gardener dismissed here, a footman not replaced when he gave notice there. The skeleton staff that travelled with the Stotesburys to Palm Beach grew slightly smaller. The entertainments grew slightly less elaborate. The balls that had once filled the ballroom with 300 guests became dinners for 50, then dinners for 20. The change was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, but the staff noticed. They always noticed. The butler tracked the household accounts and saw the figures contracting. The housekeeper counted heads and found fewer of them to govern. The French chef watched his provisioning budget shrink, the quality of ingredients subtly declining, the elaborate multi-course spectacles of the 20s giving way to simpler fare. And outside the gates of Whitemarsh Hall, the world that had made such extravagance possible was collapsing. By 1932, 1 in 4 American workers was unemployed. Bread lines stretched around city blocks in Philadelphia, 15 miles from the estate. Families who had once worked steady jobs now stood in soup kitchens waiting for a meal. And in the newspapers and the pulpits and the political speeches of the era, a new kind of anger was building, an anger directed at precisely the sort of wealth that Whitemarsh Hall represented. The Stotesburys had once been celebrated for their entertainments. Now they were criticised for them. The lavish displays that had once drawn admiring coverage in the society pages now drew something else. Resentment, contempt, the fury of a nation that had been promised prosperity and received instead ruin. Eva Stotesbury felt the shift keenly. She had spent decades cultivating her social position, building her reputation as a hostess, assembling a world in which she reigned supreme. Now that world was turning against her. The parties that had once enhanced her standing now diminished it. The $1 million annual operating costs that had once been a marker of her family's status now seemed obscene. By 1933 she had begun to pull back. The grand balls ceased. The guest list contracted. The house that had been built for entertainment fell gradually silent. The staff watched and waited and wondered how long they would remain. They did not have to wonder long. Through the mid-30s the dismissals accelerated. Wings of the house were shuttered. Rooms that had once been cleaned daily were cleaned weekly, then monthly, then not at all. The rigid hierarchy that had governed the servants' hall began to collapse as the positions that defined it were eliminated. When the third footman was let go, the distinction between third and second and first became meaningless. When the junior housemaids departed, the senior housemaids found themselves doing work that had once been beneath them. The system that had seemed so permanent, so eternal, so built into the architecture itself, revealed itself to be as fragile as any other human construction. It required maintenance, it required money. And the money was running out. Edward Stotesbury died in May of 1938. He was 89 years old. He had outlived the world he had built, but only barely. The obituaries remembered him as a titan of finance, a partner at Morgan, one of the richest men in American history. They did not linger on the state of his affairs at the moment of his death. They did not mention that the fortune had shrunk, that the investments had soured, that the maintenance of 3 palatial estates through a decade of depression had consumed capital faster than it could be replenished. Eva Stotesbury discovered these facts in the weeks after her husband's death, as the lawyers and accountants assembled the inventory of what remained. The news was not good. The depression had eviscerated the value of everything: the real estate, the art, the furnishings, the securities. What had once been worth tens of millions was now worth a fraction of that. The costs of maintaining Whitemarsh Hall remained, but the resources to pay those costs had vanished. Eva made her decision quickly. She would not attempt to hold on to the estate. She could not afford to. The house that had cost $1 million a year to operate was bleeding money she no longer had. She closed Whitemarsh Hall and retreated to El Mirasol in Palm Beach, taking with her what staff remained, leaving behind the house and the gardens and the heating plant and the pipe organ and the 45 bathrooms to settle into silence. The last of the inside staff departed in the early months of 1939. The butler who had managed the household for nearly 2 decades received his final wages and references and moved on to other employment. The housekeeper who had governed the female staff with such iron discipline found a position elsewhere. The French chef who had commanded his kitchen with the authority of an artist was among the last to go. When the kitchen fires finally went cold, when the great commercial ranges that had produced thousands of meals for hundreds of guests fell silent, an era ended. The house that had required 70 people simply to exist now required none. It stood empty, the windows dark, the corridors still, the elaborate system of bells that had once summoned servants to every corner of the estate now connected to nothing and no one. For 5 years, Whitemarsh Hall waited. Eva Stotesbury had listed it for sale, but buyers for 100-room mansions were not plentiful in 1939. The war came, America mobilized. The Depression gave way to the war economy, and the young men who might once have sought positions as footmen or gardeners found themselves in uniform instead, shipped overseas to fight a different kind of battle. The great houses of the Gilded Age, already obsolete, became relics of a vanished civilization. Who would want such a place? Who could afford to staff it? Who would choose to live in a monument built for a social order that no longer existed? In 1943, Eva Stotesbury accepted an offer. The Pensalt Chemical Corporation purchased Whitemarsh Hall for $167,000, roughly what it had cost to operate the estate for 2 months at its peak. The company planned to convert the mansion into a research laboratory, and for 2 decades scientists walked the corridors where footmen had once glided, conducting experiments in rooms that had been designed for dinner parties. The pipe organ fell silent. The ballroom held equipment instead of dancers. The 45 bathrooms served a different population, men in lab coats rather than guests in evening dress. The gardens were maintained, after a fashion, but the army of 70 groundskeepers was reduced to a skeleton crew. The estate endured, repurposed, unrecognisable. Eva Stotesbury died in 1946, 8 years after her husband, having outlived the world she had built just as he had. She never saw Whitemarsh Hall again after closing it in 1939. The woman who had reigned over the largest private house on the East Coast, who had commanded a staff of over 100, who had hosted presidents and foreign dignitaries and captains of industry, ended her days in Florida, surrounded by the diminished remnants of her former glory. The staff who had served her scattered. The hierarchy that had governed their lives dissolved. The world that had seemed so permanent proved to be as temporary as any other human arrangement. Pensalt vacated Whitemarsh Hall in 1963. The company had outgrown the facility, or the facility had proven unsuitable, or the economics had simply shifted. The reasons matter less than the result. The estate changed hands again, sold to a property investment group that had no clear plan for its future, and for the next 17 years, Whitemarsh Hall entered its final decline. The staff who remained through the 50s and into the 60s were caretakers in the truest sense, a skeleton crew charged with maintaining a structure that was slowly dying. They watched the plaster crack and fall. They reported the copper piping that disappeared to thieves in the night, stripped from the walls by scavengers who understood that the metal was worth more than the house that contained it. They locked doors and unlocked them, walked corridors that grew dustier and darker with each passing year, tended a monument that had outlived every reason for its existence. The heating plant that had once consumed rail cars of coal sat idle. The ballroom that had once held 300 guests held nothing but echoes. The elaborate network of service corridors and back staircases that had kept the servants invisible now served no purpose at all. There were no servants to hide, no masters to hide them from. The arguments over what to do with the estate dragged on for years. There were proposals to convert it to a school, a country club, a hospital. Each proposal founded on the same basic problem. The house was too big, too elaborate, too expensive to maintain, too perfectly designed for a purpose that no longer existed. The mechanical systems that had been state-of-the-art in 1921 were obsolete by 1970. The room count that had been a mark of distinction was now a liability. The architecture that had encoded an entire social order into its corridors and staircases and separate dining areas was useless for any other purpose. Whitemarsh Hall had been built to house a way of life. When that way of life ended, the house had no reason to go on. The zoning change came in 1977. The local authorities, recognising that no buyer would ever restore the estate to its former purpose, permitted the land to be rezoned for residential development. 163 townhouses and single-family homes could be built on the grounds. The house itself, the 147-room monument that had cost $100 million and required $1 million a year to maintain, was worth nothing. Less than nothing. It was an obstacle to be removed. In the spring of 1980, the wrecking crews arrived. They came wearing T-shirts that read, "Stotesbury Mansion," souvenirs of destruction, artifacts of the ending. Local residents gathered to watch. Some of them had grown up in the shadow of the estate, had passed its gates on their way to school, had glimpsed the distant silhouette of the house through the trees. They had never seen the inside. The servants' entrance and the grand entrance and the 45 bathrooms and the ballroom had been equally inaccessible to them, locked behind walls that separated the Stotesbury's world from theirs. Now, finally, they would see it, or at least they would see it fall. The demolition took a morning. The controlled explosions brought down walls that had stood for 60 years, reduced to rubble the corridors through which butlers had walked, and laundresses had carried their burdens, and French chefs had commanded their kitchens. The marble that had been imported from Europe shattered into shards. The limestone pineapples that adorned the facade became chunks of debris. The architecture that Horace Trumbauer had designed, the spaces that had encoded an entire ideology of hierarchy and separation and invisible labour, collapsed into powder and dust. When it was over, almost nothing remained. The massive limestone pillars from the front portico were left standing, a tribute, the developers called it, though to what exactly was unclear. The rest was hauled away. The land was graded and prepared for construction. Within a few years, the townhouses of Stotesbury Estates rose on the grounds, their residents parking their cars and collecting their mail, in a development named for a man whose house they had never seen, whose world they could not imagine, whose staff they would never know. But the staff had existed. That is the fact that the rubble buried, the truth that the dynamite erased. For 2 decades, Whitemarsh Hall had been home to over 100 workers, and those workers had names and wages and lives that extended beyond the corridors they walked. The Philadelphia labor records and domestic service archives of the era preserve fragments of this vanished world, incomplete, scattered, often recording only what the employers thought worth recording. The head butler appears in the ledgers, his salary documented, his position clear. The French chef appears, commanding the wages of a professional. The housekeeper appears, her authority over the female staff encoded in her compensation. But look deeper into the records, past the upper servants and the European professionals, down into the lowest tiers of the hierarchy, and names begin to emerge. A black laundress, working in the basement corridors where the wet sheets were hauled, earning a fraction of what the white staff earned for lighter work. A footman, trained to stand silently in the entrance hall, his wages recorded in a ledger that survives only by accident. These were specific people who performed specific labour, not abstractions, not symbols, but human beings who rose early and worked long hours and went to bed exhausted in the servants' quarters of a house that treated them as invisible. When the dynamite brought Whitemarsh Hall down, it buried more than a building. It buried the evidence of what had happened inside, the social order that had governed the servants' hall, the caste system that had determined who could eat with whom, and who could speak to whom, and who could walk through which corridors. It buried the architecture of separation that had kept black workers confined to the basement, while white workers moved through the upper floors. It buried the wage records that documented the precise dollar value assigned to different kinds of bodies. It buried the expertise, the decades of accumulated skill in cooking and cleaning and maintaining and serving that had kept the house alive. The limestone pillars still stand. You can see them today if you drive through Stotesbury Estates, past the townhouses and the driveways and the mailboxes, to the spot where the entrance once was. They rise from the ground like fragments of a forgotten language, marking the place where something immense once stood. The residents who pass them every day may know vaguely that a mansion once occupied this land. They may know the name Stotesbury. They may not know what it cost, not the $100 million, not the million per year, but the other cost, the human cost, the 70 gardeners and 40 inside staff, and the uncounted black workers whose labour made the whole thing possible. History records the names of the people who build monuments. It rarely records the names of the people who maintain them. The butler appears in the society pages, the laundress does not. The architect receives credit for his design. The women who scrubbed the floors he designed receive nothing. This is the erasure that the demolition completed but did not begin. The erasure began the moment the hierarchy was established. The moment some workers were deemed worthy of recording and others were not. The moment the separate staircases were built to keep certain bodies out of sight. The dynamite simply made it physical. Somewhere in the Philadelphia archives, a ledger page preserves the wages of a black laundress who worked at Whitemarsh Hall in the 1920s. Her name is there, faded but legible, next to a figure that represents what her labour was worth to the Stotesburys, a fraction of what the white staff earned, a fraction that reflected not the difficulty of her work, but the options available to her in an America that had decided, long before she was born, what a black woman's labour was worth. She hauled wet sheets through basement corridors while the butler walked the grand entrance hall. She ate her meals apart from the European staff. She was necessary, invisible, erased. The pillars remain. Her name does not circulate. The townhouses stand where the ballroom stood. The families who live there know nothing of the hierarchy that once governed these grounds. The caste system that determined who could move through which spaces. The racial order that consigned certain workers to certain jobs at certain wages. They park their cars and collect their mail and live their lives on land that was once maintained by 70 gardeners, in homes that occupy the footprint of a world that required over 100 people just to exist. That world is gone now. The dynamite saw to that. But the questions it raises have not been demolished. They linger in the spaces between what was recorded and what was forgotten, between the names that history preserved and the names it did not, between the pillars that still stand and the lives that stood behind them. The largest American house ever demolished on purpose came down in a morning. The labour that built it, that maintained it, that made it possible, that took longer to erase. It is still being erased. Every time the story is told without the names of the workers, every time the mansion is remembered and the staff is forgotten, the demolition continues. The pillars wait in the Pennsylvania light, marking nothing, commemorating no one, monuments without names.